Welcome to Nazarene, Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and this is our presentation on Yam Turua, called the Feast of Trumpets, or more accurately known as the Day of Shouting, or the Day of Shofar Blasts. And in this presentation, we're going to cover a lot of very important information that we all need to know. I think the thing to begin with, to help us understand the importance of Yam Turua, is that we need to think about Yahweh's feast dates like dates. We need to understand that Yahweh is seeking a bride for his son Yeshua, and we hope to be that bride. So the timing of the feast is very important. We need to be there when he's going to be there. We need to not stand him up, so to speak. And so there's been a tremendous amount of bad teaching on the feasts over the years. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of unlearning for many people to do. We're going to talk about all that, as well as what is the correct timing for Yam Turua. And along the way, in the second half of the presentation, we're also going to talk about the correct definitions of Aviv, meaning Aviv barley, because that influences also the timing of Yam Turua. We're also going to talk about what does the word Teruah mean. If it's Yam Turua, what is Teruah? But I think the thing that's going to help everyone put things together is coming up in the second half of the presentation, where we talk about the ancient Hebrew wedding ceremony. And this is something that's so important and so many people don't know about it. But if we understand about the two houses and also the ancient Hebrew wedding ceremony, this gives us a big picture perspective to where we can really understand much more of Scripture and what it's about, and the big picture perspective, how everything fits together. And then finally, we're also going to talk about the prophetic symbolism of Yam Turua in the book of Revelation. And all that's coming up. So stay tuned. Yahweh establishes for us our Moedim, or the appointed times, or the times that he has appointed for us to get together, to worship him, and to spend time with him, to be with him. And one of the most basic of all of the Moedim is the new moon day, or what's called in Hebrew Rosh Kadesh. Now we're going to see later Yom Teruah, or Trumpets, or the Feast of Shouting, is a very special type of Rosh Kadesh, but we want to talk about the basics of Rosh Kadesh first. So in Hebrew, the term Rosh means head, and then the term Chodesh means month. But basically what it refers to is the renewing of the moon. So the moon becomes renewed every month, and that's Rosh Kadesh, or the new moon day. So Yahweh tells us that we are to set these days apart as being special by bringing him certain offerings on the new moon days. For example, in Numbers, or Bamidbar, chapter 28, starting in verse 11, Yahweh says, "At the beginnings of your months," and then he goes on to list the offerings that we are to bring him to set the beginnings of the months apart. Well, what we're going to see is that the new moon day of the first month and also the new moon day of the seventh month are very, very special. Now, the new moon day of the first month is also what's called Rosh Hashanah, or the head of the year. It's not just Rosh Chodesh for the first month, but it's got its own special name, Rosh Hashanah. And the reason why is that whenever the new moon day for the first month is set, that's going to impact and establish the timing for every other feast in the calendar year. So we talk about this in the book study, Establishing the Head of the Year. And establishing the head of the year is effectively the transcripts for the videos that we're going to be including in this video study. Now, a little bit later, we're going to see that Yom Teruah, or the Day of Trumpets, or the Day of Shouting, is effectively the new moon day for the seventh month. So it's Rosh Chodesh for the seventh month. But again, it's got special requirements, and there's special things to do, so it's got its own name, Yom Teruah, or the Day of Shouting. So before we talk about Yam Turua, first we want to talk about Rosh Hashanah. We want to talk about how to establish the head of the year, because if we don't establish the head of the year right, we're not going to be able to keep Yam Turua in the right time. And that's going to be a big problem, because as we're going to see coming up in the second half of this video, The timing of Yam Turua is very, very important. We need to be there at the right time. We're going to miss out on some very, very, very special blessings. And again, it's a big problem because a lot of wrong things have been taught over the years. So we need to establish, well, first we need to explain what are those wrong things, and then we need to establish what are the right things that we should be doing. So there is a big key to timing Rosh Hashanah correctly, and that is to focus upon the wave sheaf of barley, or what's called the Omer. We're going to see the reason for that is that the Omer is symbolic of Yeshua, our first fruits. So just like we know, we're told that all of Scripture speaks of Yeshua, so all of Scripture revolves around Yeshua, the whole calendar is going to revolve around the Omer because it is symbolic of Yeshua. So that's why we talk about it in our other studies in establishing the head of the year. We explain that 15 to 21 days after Rosh Hashanah, a Levitical priesthood is going to have a requirement to present the very first full sheaf of Aviv or medium dough barley in the whole land of Israel to Yahweh. And the idea is to bring the very first of the barley, again, because this Omer offering or this presentation sheaf or this wave sheaf is symbolic of Yeshua, our first fruits. Now we know that this is symbolic of Yeshua because, again, everything in Scripture refers to Yeshua. And apart from that, the Apostle Shaul tells us that it refers to Yeshua. So in 1 Corinthians, or Korinthim Aleph, chapter 15, starting in verse 20, the Apostle Shaul tells us, he says, now Messiah Yeshua is risen from the dead and has become the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. And then he explains how we're all going to die, and yet those who believe in Yeshua are all going to be made alive again. In verse 23, he says, but yet each one will come alive again in his own order. First will be the resurrection of Messiah, the first fruits, and then afterwards, those who belong to Messiah at his second coming. So again, the presentation of the wave sheaf is extremely symbolic, and it's very important for any believer in Messiah Yeshua to understand these things. So the problem is that there's also a false timing of Rosh Hashanah, and that's why there's so many people this year who are on the wrong calendar. They're worshiping a month late. And part of the reason for this, I'm going to try and say this as nicely as possible, but to give an example, in 2021 CE, this year, when we're filming this video, there were certain Karaites who are basically Sadducees, and also certain Messianic barley search groups who are teaching incorrectly that the Omer, or the presentation sheaf, or the wave sheaf of barley doesn't need to be of the true first fruits. That means it doesn't necessarily need to be the first of the barley. So what the Karaite doctrine is, and what the Messianics parrot because of the Karaites, the Karaite doctrine is first you should bring in the harvest, then you can take some random sheaf of barley from that full harvest and then bring what we would call an anti-sheaf. In other words, it's a false sheaf. It's not the correct sheaf. It's not the way to do it. It's not the true first fruits of barley. The first fruit, when you look up the term, it's intuitive. The first fruits, which are the first. But when you bring in the main harvest and then bring some random sampling of barley from the harvest, that's not the true first fruits. So this is the problem, is the Karaites are teaching that you don't have to bring the first fruits. You can just bring any old sheaf of barley. And we talk about that a lot in the other presentations. Now, again, as we explained in establishing the head of the year and in the video Aviv Barley Simplified, the correct way to establish the timing of Rosh Hashanah, or the new moon day of the first month, is to cite the very first sheaf of Aviv, or medium dough barley, in the land of Israel. Again, the very first of the first fruits, symbolic of Yeshua. And then we're going to cite the first crescent sliver of the new moon from the land of Israel. And that's when the priesthood is going to declare Rosh Hashanah. Okay, now we need to understand that it's the new moon of the first month, and it can take place irregardless or irrespective of the spring. There's a lot of teachers who use the phrase the spring feasts and the fall feasts. And a lot of our earlier material, we also used these wrong terms because we didn't know any better. But Yahweh has since then given us more light. There's big problems using the phrase spring feasts or using the terms spring feasts and fall feasts because they're not necessarily accurate. For example, in 2021, this year, the first fruits of barley was ready before spring. So the rabbis use the terms spring feasts and fall feasts, but the rabbis have all sorts of sun worship incorporated into their calendar. In fact, not many people know, but the rabbis actually hold a day in honor of the sun once every 18 years. So it's very dangerous to use terms that don't appear in Scripture, because when you talk both astronomically and also astrologically, spring is declared when the vernal or the spring equinox, which is also called the equilux, that's when spring begins. So what the equinox or the equilux is, so you have the rotations of the earth around the sun, and then you have summer when the days are the longest and the nights are the shortest, and then it comes to winter when the nights are the longest and the days are the shortest. But there's 2 times a year, one in what's called spring and the other in what we call fall, when the day and the night are of equal length. And that's what the term equilux or equinox means. So equinox means equal night. So it's equal parts night, equal parts day. And that, or you could call it the equilux. It's the same thing. Equal parts lux or light versus equal parts night. So in other words, you've got 24 hours in a day. At the equinoxes or the equiluxes, you've got 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night, or you've got 12 hours of night, 12 hours of day. Take your pick. There's certain Messianic teachers out there who are teaching that no. There's a big difference between the equinox and the equilux, and we shouldn't keep the equinox because that's of Satan, but we should keep the equilux because that's not of Satan, even though it's just another word for the same thing. There's some really, really, really bad, terrible teaching out there, and it's really sad to watch. The vast majority of the Messianic movement is following behind this teacher who's teaching these completely wrong, illogical things. So we talk about these in our studies. But the big problem with using the equinox or the equilux is that we end up watching the movements of the earth around the sun. And that's precisely what Yahweh says to do. Yahweh says not to pay attention to the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars. But that's what the term spring refers to, is when you have the equinox or the equilux. Now, so we talked about that in the video, Where is Spring Commanded? Because it's not. We also talk about it in another video called Where is the Equinox Commanded? We cover the same topic basically from a different angle. We point out that spring begins at the vernal or the spring equinox. Once again, it's how do you determine it? It's when the day and the night are of equal length. And this is a discovery. Yahweh never mentions the equinox or the equilux anywhere in Scripture. He doesn't have anything that even resembles how to determine when the day and the night are of equal length. He doesn't tell us to do that. That was first discovered by the Greeks. So why would anyone incorporate Greek concepts into a Hebrew or Hebraic calendar? It makes no sense. But this is what the rabbis do. This is also what the Karaites are doing. And it's also, sadly, what the majority of Messianics are doing in 2021, because they're simply parroting whatever the Karaites say at this particular point in time. But the problem is that the concepts of a spring equinox and a fall equinox do not appear in Scripture. These concepts have been added to Scripture, which qualifies as false worship. So the term in Scripture, the term worship, is derived from worthship. So if you worship Yahweh, you consider him and him alone to be worthy of telling you how to keep your calendar. But if you look at the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars to determine your calendar, then you're considering the sun, the moon, and the stars to be worthy of telling you when and how to keep your calendar. And then when you go to try to mix the two, that really doesn't work, because Yahweh tells us that he will not share his glory with any other. So we need to be really careful if we're going to say that we worship Yahweh, that we consider him worthy to be the one to set our calendar, then we need to go by what he says and not add Greco-Roman Babylonian concepts into the mix. So then in the video, again, in Aviv Barley Simplified, we showed how the feasts of the first month, or Rosh Hashanah, are correctly established by finding the first complete sheaf of Aviv or medium dough barley in the land of Israel, finding the first fruits of barley, and then by sighting the first crescent sliver of the new moon from the land of Israel. And if you do that, that's what Nazarene Israel is doing this year, and that's why we are holding the feast at this particular point in time. There's a lot of people worshiping a month too late this year, and one of the reasons for that is that they're not obeying the face value of Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 9. We talk about this in the video, Let's Not Break Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. So the face value, or the pashat, of Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9 tells us that when we cut the Aviv barley first fruits, that's when we need to begin our 50-day Omer count up to Shavuot, or Pentecost. So in other words, when we begin to cut, that's when we begin our count. Or you could say, we begin to count when we begin to cut. But just to say this as nicely as possible, this year, in 2021 CE, we had certain Karaite and some other certain Messianic barley search teams saying, no, you don't need to obey the face value of Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. No, you don't need to begin your 50-day Omer count when you begin cutting, but rather you can cut your first fruits of barley and just lay them to one side, and then you bring in the main harvest a month or two later, and that's when you begin your count, is when you bring in the main body of the harvest. They're saying it has nothing to do with the first fruits. Now, we can understand why the Karaites could believe this way, because the Karaites don't believe on Yeshua as the Messiah, and therefore they don't understand the role of Yeshua as the first fruits. But why the Messianic groups don't understand the role of Yeshua as the first fruits, that we don't quite understand. So to find out more information, that's a good study to watch. Now, we were trying to communicate with the Karaites, or the Sadducees. We sent them letters, we tried corresponding with them, we tried communicating with them in various ways. Didn't get the answers we were hoping for. So we did a little bit more with the answers that we did get. We did a little bit more investigation and research, and we looked at their studies. And what we then did a study on Josephus, the Talmud, and the Omer. And in this video study, what we saw is one of the reasons now it's very interesting. The Karaites will tell you that they don't follow the Talmud, but secretly they do. And they may not even be aware that that's what they're doing, but they look at the Talmud as a reliable historical resource. And what we find when we study the Talmud is the Talmud tells us precisely that it's okay to cut the first fruits of your barley and lay them to one side, and then wait for the main body of the harvest. And that's when you begin your Omer count, is when you bring in the main harvest. So the Karaites literally are following what's written in the Talmud, thinking that what's written in the Talmud is what's written in Scripture. But we, of course, as followers of Yeshua, understand that what's written in the Talmud are the traditions and teachings of the rabbis, and the traditions and teachings of the rabbis very often contradict the teachings of Yeshua's Father, Yahweh. So that's a very interesting study for those of you who want to check that out. And then what's really sad is to see how many Messianic groups are following after the Karaites, just because whatever the Karaites say, they assume that that's got to be correct, when in fact it directly violates Scripture. So if you'd like to see how the Karaites are violating Scripture and why, I encourage you to check out the study Josephus, the Talmud, and the Omer. Well, another Karaite doctrine is what's called harvestable fields being required for the day of the wave sheaf offering. And again, so this is related to the earlier study. The Karaites have a belief that you have to be able to bring in the main body of the harvest before you can declare the wave sheaf offering and then begin your 50-day count up to Shavuot or Pentecost. So that's why they teach, if you have any barley that needs to get harvested early and laid aside, you just harvest it and lay it aside. And so you can violate the face value of Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9, because it's not really violating the face value of Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9, although that's exactly what they're doing. So they've got this, they can't see that they're contradicting scripture because they're following the Talmud rather than following the commandments of our Father Yahweh. We talk about that in the study, the error of harvestable fields. And one of the big problems that they get into with this is the term Aviv refers to barley that is tender, young, and green. And when they're talking about bringing in the main body of the harvest, you're talking about barley that is mature, brown, and hard. There's nothing about a harvest that's a harvest-ready barley that's tender, young, and green. Harvest-ready barley is hard, dry, and brown, and that's what they're not taking into account. So in the Karaite model, a lot of the Messianic groups are following it. They literally let the true first fruits of barley fall to the ground. They basically, if you're a farmer with a field of barley that comes ripe early, you're going to lose your crop, because the Karaites are waiting for the main harvest to come ripe, which is usually like a month later or something like that. Can be even more than a month later. So anyway, check out that study if you want to know what's wrong with the Karaite theory. There's another reason that so many Messianics are keeping the feasts a month late this year is because they're following a particular barley search group that talks about the alleged need to qualify your fields. And there's a particular Messianic barley search leader who teaches that you can't grow barley on hills. If it's on a hillside, you can't harvest it, or you can't use that, or if the field has too many rocks in it, that's disqualified as a field. And this is really quite surprising, because for anyone who's been to the land of Israel, it's basically hills and rocks. And one of the blessings of barley is that it grows quite well in rocky and hilly terrain. That's probably one of the reasons why Yahweh uses it, is that it grows so very well in both rocky and hilly terrain. So here we've got this Aviv barley, this Messianic brother, effectively, and he's disqualifying anything with hills and rocks. And in fact, he even disqualifies Jericho, which is extremely ironic, because that's where Israel first offered the wave sheaf offering when they entered the land in Joshua chapter 5. So this brother is basically adding all sorts of requirements to scripture that don't exist. So he's adding things. Whatever Yahweh says, apparently, for this brother are not sufficient. He feels the need to add his own requirements because apparently, according to him, Yahweh couldn't figure it out. So anyway, read the study Establishing the Head of the Year to see what it is that we're supposed to be doing. And these are the studies that, this is why we are celebrating Yam Turua now instead of a month later, with most of the people who are celebrating a month too late, because most people are following the Karaites, who secretly are following the Pharisees and what the Pharisees wrote in the Talmud. And it's not right. It's not correct. So again, it's important to establish the head of the year correctly, because it's going to determine then the dates of Yom Teruah, the day of trumpets, or the day of shouting, or the day of shofar blasts. Now, as long as we're on the timing, as if that wasn't enough, there's more. So see if you can follow this. So the rabbis incorrectly say, let's back up. The rabbis incorrectly say, now we know that according to scripture, the new moon day of the first month, so Rosh Kadesh for the first month, is also Rosh Hashanah, or the head of the year. But the rabbis say that Rosh Hashanah, or the head of the year, is actually in the 7th month. So the rabbis will call the 7th month Rosh Hashanah, in addition to calling it Yam Teruah. And this makes no sense, because why would Yahweh start a calendar in the 7th month? So Yam Teruah is the first day of the 7th month. I mean, how many calendars do you begin at month 7? I mean, when we begin counting, do we begin counting 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12? Or do you begin 1, 2, 3, 4? So anyway, not only does it make no sense, but it also contradicts Yahweh when he gives the commandment in Shemot, or Exodus chapter 12 and verse 2. So Yahweh says, this month, which he's giving this commandment about the time that the barley was found to be Aviv, or tender, young, and green. He says, this month shall be your beginning of months. He's talking about winter is over. So now they're starting into the growing season. He says, this month, when they're starting to come into the summer growing season, this month shall be the beginning of your months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. And the rabbis say, no. The first month of the year comes at the end of the growing season, in what most people would call the fall. So that's another thing that the rabbis do to be aware of. And the rabbis also call Yam Turua the first of what they call, it's the so-called Yamim Noraim, or what they call the 10 days of awe. And it's important to realize that this term, 10 days of awe, doesn't exist in Scripture. So that's why we don't use the term, because we don't like speaking apart from Scripture. We don't like adding things to Scripture. We figure Yahweh is plenty capable of telling us what he wants done, so we try to teach what he wants done rather than making up our own rules. And then finally, another thing that the rabbis do wrong is that they have the Rabbinic Yam Turua, or the Rabbinic Rosh Hashanah, they would call it, lasts for 2 days, whereas in Scripture, it's only supposed to last 1 day. It's the first day of the 7th month, not the first and second days of the 7th month. Okay, so there's all that regarding the timing, and this is what Yahweh says in Leviticus, or Vayikra, chapter 23, starting in verse 23. Yahweh spoke to Moshe, saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, not the first and second days, but the first day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest. It's a memorial of blowing trumpets. It's a set-apart rehearsal, or a holy convocation. And he says, you shall do no customary work on it. So this is a day that call your employer and let him know this is a set-apart day for you. He says, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. So this is a special day we need to set aside so we can be with our husband. So now we want to talk about what is Yam Teruah. And this is we're going to get into some definitions here, and then we're going to wrap from here. We're going to go into the concept of the Hebrew wedding feast. So think about the wedding feast when we're looking at these definitions. So we take a look at the word Teruah. It's Strong's Hebrew Concordance. It's Hebrew 8643. Teruah. It's from Hebrew 7321. That means a clamor, or in other words, an acclamation of joy, or also a battle cry, especially a clangor of trumpets as an alarm. That's where we get the concept of the Feast of Trumpets. So, but it's not just trumpets. It's an acclamation of joy, but it's also a battle cry, especially a clangor of trumpets as an alarm. It gives translations: alarm, blow or blowing of the trumpets, joy. We think about the concept of a wedding. We talk about joy, jubilee, loud noise, rejoicing, shouting, making a joyful sound or making a joyful noise unto Yahweh. So now let's look up the reference to the root at Hebrew 7321. We come here and the root word is ruah, and it means to mar, as in to mar the silence or to break the silence. In other words, figuratively, to split the ears with sound. Okay, so it's a shout, as in a shout of alarm, but also a shout of joy. So it's to blow an alarm or to blow a trumpet or to cry an alarm or to cry aloud, to destroy the silence, to make a joyful noise, to shout for joy, or to sound an alarm, but especially in the sense of a triumph. And we're shouting for joy because we're waiting for our bridegroom to come back and be triumphal and victorious. So now that we understand what Yam Turua is, and especially the timing of Yam Turua, now let's take a look and see how Yam Turua fits in the ancient Hebrew wedding model. We're going to see even more symbolism and more meaning. That's going to help us to understand why the shouts that we give on Yam Turua are not only alarms for battle, but they're also shouts of joy. So in the ancient Hebrew wedding model, there's three main phases, and these correspond to the three pilgrimage feasts. The first of the pilgrimage feasts is the Pesach or Passover, and this corresponds to the first phase in the ancient Hebrew wedding called Shidduchin, and this refers to the match. So an example of Shidduchin is when Abraham sent his servant Eliezer to take a bride for his son Yitzhak, or Isaac. And according to the story, Eliezer prayed and Yahweh led him straight to Rivka, or Rebekah. And then according to the story, Eliezer gave both Rivka and her family all sorts of gifts. And there's no way to know really whether Eliezer was giving these as what today is called matan, meaning bridal gifts, or mohar, meaning dowry. And it really doesn't matter because the whole purpose of giving matan and mohar is to gain favor with the family. And that's because, at least in Scripture, the determining factor is not a piece of paper, it's not a signature, it's nothing like that. It's not an amount paid. In Scripture, the determining factor is the agreement, which today they would call the meeting of the minds. But in ancient times, there was an agreement to marry, and that's called Shidduchin. And then, of course, there can also be a covenantal meal that sort of solidifies the agreement to marry. Now, on the first Pesach in Egypt, Yahweh shared a covenantal meal with Israel, and then Yahweh took Israel out of Egypt as a bride for his son Yeshua. And Israel received certain objects of silver and gold from the Egyptians. And if we're willing to accept it, we could consider that these were a kind of a mohar, and also as matan, meaning dowry and bridal gifts. And Yahweh also gave Israel promises of inheritance in a land of milk and honey. But again, this is still the selection stage. So it's a private agreement. The marriage doesn't become officially binding until later. Now, in the first century, we see the same basic elements. Yeshua took his disciples to himself as his bride. It's important to recognize that the marriage is for the disciples. There will be more people at the marriage, more people in the kingdom, but it's the disciples who are taken as the bride. And again, they shared a covenantal meal together to celebrate the match, or the shidduch. And the marriage would become official later at Shavuot, or Pentecost, when they received Yeshua's spirit, and that's officially the oneness between the two of them. Now we come to the second phase of the ancient Hebrew wedding, and that's called Erusin, and this corresponds to Shavuot, or Pentecost. So now notice, at Erusin, the wedding is going to become lawfully binding, and this is because there's a public announcement. So the couple is giving their word publicly that they intend to marry. And in ancient times, a man was considered only as good as his word. So when you gave your word, that was it. And it's very different than today's marriages, where now it only becomes binding when you have a formally signed piece of paper filed with the government or something like that. Very different in the ancient Hebrew model. So depending upon the era, Israel has a very long history. Depending upon the era, there could be a formal ceremony. There was no formal ceremony in the days of Eliezer and Rivka, but there could be a formal ceremony, and there could be a public announcement of the match. And sometimes the mohar and matan were also delayed until the formal ceremony. There could also be a signed agreement called a ketubah, and this would specify both the requirements of the bride and the promises made to the bride. So an example is the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai. Now, in today's In today's agreements, the ketubah has to be signed in order for it to be valid, but this was not originally the case. When we look back at ancient times, there was simply an agreement between Abraham's representative Eliezer and Rivka's father, and then the bride gave her consent, and that's what made for the marriage. So after the public announcement, it bears repeating, the marriage is both formal and binding, even though the consummation doesn't take place right away. And this is why Miriam, or Mary, could have technically have been stoned to death when she was found to be pregnant. So even though the marriage had not been consummated, she had already given her word. So again, the point is that in Hebraic thought, when you give your word and you enter into an agreement, when you enter into a covenant relationship, it is a very big deal. So we who live in the West need to retrain ourselves to be careful about giving our word, because in Yahweh's sight, when we give our word, that's it. And traditionally, after Erusin, the bride and the groom are kept apart, and they communicate through the groom's best friend, which in this case is Yeshua's spirit. So with us, in our case, Yeshua's spirit, the groom's best friend, shares with us as his bride what it is that the groom likes so that we can learn how to please him. Now, during this time, while she's waiting for the wedding, the bride works on her wedding dress, and of course her wedding dress should be spotless and without blemish. She's also going to name several virgins to be witnesses at the consummation. So now when the groom comes for his bride, the virgin bridesmaids are going to go with the bride, and again, they're going to serve both as witnesses and as assistants at the consummation and perhaps during the wedding week. Now, for his part, after the wedding is announced, the groom is going to begin adding on a room to his father's house where he and his bride are going to live. Now, usually this would take, not in every case, but usually the groom would add on this extra room over the summer, and then it would be ready after the harvest season around the time of the 7th month. In other words, Yam Turua. So what would happen is when the father saw that the room was ready and everything was all prepared, then he would give his son permission to bring his bride back home. And then it could be the consummation phase. So what would happen then is the bridegroom would send a herald to announce his soon coming arrival with shofar blasts. We don't know how many shofar blasts, but possibly 7. We'll take a look in the book of Revelation. Possibly 7 shofar blasts, 7 trumpet calls. And the purpose of these 7 trumpet calls would be to alert the bride and her bridesmaids that the groom was coming. This is Yam Turua. So the bridesmaids would then trim their lamps and then go out to meet the groom when he came, traditionally at midnight. And again, this is where we also get the concept that the bridegroom will come back at Yom Kippur. And then they would all go back to the groom's father's house, and there would be a wedding feast which would last for a week. And there would also be the consummation of the marriage. So now we see this. Now notice in context, we've just finished with Matthew chapter 24, where Yeshua explains about the tribulation that's coming. So right after the tribulation of Matthew 24, in Matthew 25, starting in verse 1, Yeshua says, "Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom." He says, "But now 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. Those who were foolish took their lamps but took no oil with them. But the wise took oil in their vessels with their lamps. And while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept." Now, so traditionally, we'll talk about this more next week, traditionally the bridegroom will return around midnight on Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And this comes 10 days after Yam Turua. So if we go to the study Revelation of the End Times, or you can watch this on video in Revelation Simplified, we see that in the end times, when we're looking at the Revelation timeline, there's 7 seals and then 7 trumpets or 7 shofars or 7 shouts of alarm. And then you have 7 cups or vials, which takes place quickly. And then Yeshua returns at Armageddon, which would be Yom Kippur. We'll talk more about that next week. But this helps us to understand why in Strong's Hebrew Concordance, this sound of the trumpets that we hear, it isn't necessarily only an alarm. It's not only necessarily a battle cry, but it's also a cry for joy because our bridegroom is returning for his bride. That's our presentation on Yom Teruah, or the Day of Shouting. Please join us next week for Yom Kippur. Shalom.